This is our discussion of critical thinking, and it's meant to replace the lecture on Friday, June 2nd. And so before I get into the slides on critical thinking, I wanted to make just 3 quick notes about how the video is going to work. So first, this video is a bit odd because I'm doing it based on what I think we'll get to in class on Thursday and picking up with where I think we'll leave off. But that may or may not be the case. So if there's parts of class that we miss, there's parts that we haven't gotten to yet, I'll post a little video that kind of fills in the gap between what we did in class and where this video starts. And I'll start this video with a quick review of what I expect we will have talked about in class. The second thing I wanted to mention is that instead of projecting the slides like I usually would in class, I'm going to keep them open like this. And as we talk, I'm going to kind of create text boxes and type into the slides like I would if I was writing on the PowerPoints in class. And so throughout the video, there will be places where I'll ask you to stop and answer questions for yourself. And so I would encourage you to pause the video and really think about what a definition would be or what an example of something would be. And third, just in the interest of length and ease of uploading and downloading the video for you guys, I'm probably going to make this a series of videos, maybe some for a brief set of slides, so that we can kind of chunk it together, and so it's easier for you to view a portion of the video. So with that being said, let's dive into critical thinking. And so I'm going to briefly overview what I expect that we will have talked about in class. And so we probably would have started talking about critical thinking as another aspect of higher order thinking. So kind of these higher order cognitive processes that IP theory doesn't quite effectively account for. The second thing that we're going to be talking about is definitions of critical thinking. And so we'll talk about kind of what our own definitions are, and then we'll start talking about more of a theoretical definition. And so we'll talk about the basis of critical thinking as claims and evidence, or claims and justifications, and how critical thinking involves reasoning about the quality of evidence, reasoning about arguments and counter-arguments, or thesis and antithesis, so what we'll call dialectical thinking, or thinking about both sides of the issue, considering claims and counterclaims, and then arriving at synthesis. And so the place that we'll leave off probably has to do with the 4 components of critical thinking. And I'll have introduced these in class. And we'll probably make a list of different dispositions or attitudes that are associated with critical thinking. And the last thing that we'll talk about in class are skills associated with critical thinking. And we'll probably look at some of these examples to identify specific skills associated with critical thinking. And so I want to pick up right here in talking about an overview of some of the skills that we're talking about when we think about critical thinking, as well as thinking about how we can facilitate transfer and metacognition, what those are, and more generally, how we can foster critical thinking in the classroom. So with that, let's talk about some of the skills that we need for critical thinking. And I know that we made a whole big list of those in class, but there's some that I want to talk about in particular. So the ones that kind of stick out to me from our discussion are, first of all, verbal reasoning skills. So when we talk about constructing arguments or presenting claims and evidence, typically we're talking about critical thinking as happening orally or in writing, so having some linguistic component. And of course, that doesn't always have to be the case, but in order to critique something, as we do with critical thinking, or in order to evaluate something, we have to use language. And so one of the skills that contributes to critical thinking is being able to articulate what our critical thinking is. And actually, this is a good place to pause the video and think about, okay, well, what are verbal reasoning skills, or kind of on the contrary, can you have critical thinking without being able to express it linguistically, either through word or through writing? Of course, we're talking about argument analysis skill, and we remember from our discussion in class that when we're talking about arguments, we're talking about claims and evidence. And so what I mean for that is being able to decompose an argument into the claim and the evidence, being able to evaluate the evidence, being able to determine whether the evidence supports the claim that's being made. And again, just like verbal reasoning skills, we can think about this as really fundamental to critical thinking. When we're talking about science as a domain, and we'll talk about the domain specificity of critical thinking in just 1 minute, we can talk about hypothesis testing, so setting out a hypothesis, collecting evidence, determining whether evidence supports the hypothesis. And I'll just point out that within a scientific context, hypothesis is a form of argument, right? We're saying this is my claim, that's my hypothesis, this is the evidence that proves or disproves the claim. We talked about a variety of probability related reasoning. A lot of that happens in the social sciences and in public discourse. So, understanding likelihood or uncertainty. So, if a meteorologist says, there's a 50% chance of rain tomorrow, or an epidemiologist says if this decreases the likelihood of contracting a virus by 15%, understanding what it means. We can talk about a lot of other skills associated with that. So things like correlation, causation, representativeness, and other terms that you've probably heard in your various social science classes for ways to reason about quantitative evidence in particular. So ways to reason about statistics. So I'll put statistics here as kind of the evidence base here. For hypothesis testing, we're talking about scientific reasoning. Of course, decision making and problem solving, going back to our earlier discussion. So decision making in particular is, again, you can put it within an argument framework. So if I made a particular decision, if I made a particular choice, critical thinking is, okay, what was the evidence behind that choice? Why do I think it was the correct or the incorrect decision? And two other types of reasoning that I want to point out are deductive and inductive reasoning. And so this is kind of a broad distinction that's drawn in the literature. And so you can think about what each of these words means. So to deduce something, I always like to think of Sherlock Holmes. And so when we're talking about deductive reasoning, and again, I'll just point out that we're always talking about arguments. We're always talking about the relationship between claims and evidence. So when we're talking about deductive reasoning skills, what we're talking about is making sure that the claim is justified based on the evidence presented. So it's going from the evidence that we have and making sure that it supports a particular claim. And I like to think of it kind of as a funnel. So we start at the top with the evidence that we have and we zero in on a particular claim. And we can contrast that with inductive reasoning. And again, I'll ask you to think about what that word really means. And so to induce something, thinking about, this is a little graphic, but I like to think about kind of inducing labor, right? Forcing something, and you're forcing something to come out. And so when we talk about inductive reasoning, we talk about the generalizability of the claim. So kind of the claim and beyond. And really, inductive reasoning is a question of generalizability. Make sure I'm spelling that correctly. And so the question becomes, does the claim that I am producing based on evidence apply in all of the various contexts in which it could potentially be relevant? So let's take an example in school of ways that we might help students to engage in deductive and inductive reasoning. So for example, I might give students a science experiment where I ask them to use different kinds of soils to help a plant grow. And so looking at the different soil compositions based on the evidence of plant growth, I'll be able to come to a claim about this is the soil that helps plants grow the highest. And that would be an example of deductive reasoning, of helping students figure out the claim of this is the best type of soil based on the evidence that I've collected. But then there's a second kind of question that we can ask students to answer, and that's one based on inductive reasoning. So that's the question of, is this soil always going to be the most effective soil? And there's not as direct evidence that we can necessarily collect from that, but that's a question of generalizability. And it may be the case that this is the best kind of soil for vegetables. But if we have something like a cactus or a plant that doesn't grow in as nutrient-rich soil, then that claim doesn't generalize. That soil is not the best in all of those situations. Again, thinking about deductive and inductive reasoning, we can take an example in government. So, for example, we can take the claim that democracy is the best form of government, and I can ask students to collect a variety of evidence to support that claim. So I can look at the stability of governments and people's trust in government, so public opinion polling, and see if that evidence supports the claim that democracy is the best form of government. And that would be helping students to engage in deductive reasoning, evaluating that evidence and making sure it supports a claim. But I should also be asking students to engage in inductive reasoning. So thinking about the generalizability of the claims I'm making. So is democracy the best government system for everybody? So does it work in countries that have a lot of, for example, diversity versus countries that are very homogenous in terms of its population? Does it work for countries that have a lot of resources that are very kind of equally distributed versus countries that don't have a lot of resources or have resources that are very unequally distributed? So people have different kinds of powers. So that's looking at the generalizability of the claim, the extent to which it extends to other situations. And we want to be asking students to engage in both types of these reasoning. And so, of course, I'm presenting each of these skills along with the ones that we talked about on previous slides as separate things. But really, when we're engaging students in critical thinking activities, we're asking students to engage all of these skills. So if I'm asking students to have a debate about what are different forms of government, then I'm absolutely helping them to engage in verbal reasoning skills because they're articulating what their position is. I'm having them engage in argumentation because they're supposed to be making claims and providing evidence. I'm helping them, maybe not necessarily hypothesis testing or probability, although they may be using that to evaluate some of the evidence and the research they're gathering. But I'm definitely asking them to use deductive reasoning. So does the evidence for democracy support the claim you're making? I'm definitely asking them to think about inductive reasoning. So does this generalize to all situations, or is it situation specific? Likewise, if I'm doing a science experiment, I'm asking students to write about or talk about their hypotheses. I'm asking them to specifically articulate what they are. I'm asking them to evaluate evidence. I'm asking them to think about the correspondence between evidence and claims, so deductive reasoning, as well as to think about the impact or the generalizability of their findings, so to also engage in inductive reasoning. And so the takeaway here, and we'll talk about this on a later slide when we start to get into instructional implications, is that we should be engaging students in all of these skills simultaneously. And an effective critical thinking activity engages all of these skills to varying extents. So far we've talked about the two initial components of critical thinking instruction: dispositions and attitudes, so the kind of orientations that students have to have in the classroom in order to think critically, and the instruction or practice of critical thinking skills. Before we move on to transfer, I just want to make a quick note about skills, which is something I mentioned. And so we talked about critical thinking as really based around critically evaluating claims and evidence for those claims. And of course, claim and evidence together make up an argument. And so when we evaluate arguments, we talk about them as domain specific. And I'll just remind you from class that when I say domain specific, by domain I mean subject area. And by specific, I mean that it belongs to one particular subject area. So for example, English or math or history. And so here, what I'm going to ask you to do, and I'm realizing that my text boxes look a bit off. What I'm going to ask you to do is pause the video and think about a particular subject area that you're very comfortable with: history, English, math, what have you. And thinking about critical thinking as evaluating claims and evidence, figure out what counts as evidence in your particular domain. What is the basis upon which we formulate claims? And how do we evaluate evidence? What are the criteria that we want students to set out for evaluating claims and evidence? So I'll let you pause here. So pick a domain and come up with evaluations and evidence for your domain. And let's look at some examples. So when we talk about history, we can start with thinking about, okay, what counts as evidence in history? And so we can talk about primary and secondary sources, which oftentimes count as evidence, artifacts, so any kind of if you think about something like anthropology, so particular objects that are found, and potentially, so we talked about writing, artifacts, and any kind of, I guess, survey reports from the time would also be, sorry, I'm getting communications in. Artifacts, so any kind of statistical evidence from the time. So for example, historians will often look at things like population surveys. We can also think about in ancient history excavations. So basically history has a particular set of evidence associated with that domain. Let me see if I can make these bigger so they fit into my box. And so the first thing to point out is this is evidence in history. So in history, we really care about what makes something a primary versus a secondary source in ways that we do not when we talk about mathematics. And so that's what makes it domain specific. But the criteria that we use to evaluate evidence, so what counts as good evidence, is also domain specific. So in history, we ask things like, okay, well, what is the bias of the articles? And we care a lot about that in ways that we don't necessarily for science. We care about temporality or currency. So in history, it really matters when something was written. That is one of the ways in which I evaluate evidence. Likewise, one of the ways that I evaluate it is what point of view it's coming from. So it really matters if my description is from the winning army or the losing army. And so those are all criteria that we use to evaluate evidence in history. Let's take another example. So let's take science. So first we can talk about what counts as evidence in science. And so take a minute, you can pause the video and think about it. And hopefully you can say things like, in science we care a lot about direct observation. So that's empiricism. In science we also, let me make this a little bit smaller. In science, of course, we also care a lot about the experimental method. And kind of hand in hand with the experimental method is in science we talk a lot about hypothesis testing. So what counts as evidence is if I put out a hypothesis and then I collect experimental or observational data to either confirm or disconfirm my hypothesis. So let me make this a bit smaller. And so again, I'll just point out that direct observation is not a source of evidence really that you could expect to reasonably use in history. But it is one that we use a lot in science, right? We use it when we ask students to measure plants in science class or observe clouds every day and draw them or observe the classroom pet. Which comes to how do we evaluate evidence from science? And again, the criteria that we use to evaluate evidence in science is unique. So first we look at, going hand in hand with the experimental method, we look at experimental design or methodology. So we look at how did we actually come up with this evidence, the process of how we came up with the methods in a way that we do not necessarily in history or in another subject area. We also evaluate in a big way in science based on replicability. So can I recreate this experiment given the same conditions? And again, that's not really something that we would expect to do in history. And going hand in hand with the hypothesis testing, part of the way that we can evaluate evidence is around predictability, right? So scientific theories also suggest, going back to inductive reasoning, also suggest that if I have a hypothesis and it's based on good evidence, then I can predict what would happen in a future situation and confirm my hypothesis. And that's how I evaluate the quality of my evidence, in part, is around its predictability. And we wouldn't necessarily have that in mathematics or in English. Let's take another example. So let's talk about evidence as the basis for claims and how we can evaluate that evidence in the context of, let's do English. So what counts as evidence in English? So evidence in English is always typically the text base, right? So whatever the particular author wrote. We also tend to talk about author bio. So thinking about what was the context around a particular work being produced. And we also tend to talk about kind of secondary sources in terms of critical narration or critical perception of English essays. So I'll write critical essays. And so, somewhat like in history, we have this distinction between primary and secondary sources. But in English, we really emphasize the text base, I think to more of an extent than we do in history, where I think we both consider primary and secondary sources, but you can certainly see some parallels there. And then how we evaluate evidence in English is also domain specific. So we can think about things like what was the author's meaning? What was the temporally, or what was the period understanding of text? How does the text fit in with particular genre? So, for example, in English, one of the ways we evaluate the quality of evidence, so the quality of the text base, is thinking about, does this fit into the Romantic period or does this fit into the Gothic period? So, to what extent does this text uphold genre conventions? And that's not really a standard of evidence that we would necessarily use in history. And I just want to do one more example since we have Brianna in the room. So let's talk about Spanish, which is not kind of second language learning is not necessarily a domain that we're all familiar with. But what would count as evidence and criteria for evaluation in the case of Spanish? And so the evidence, I think, for second language learning is a lot kind of native speaker conventions, right? So what would a native speaker say? And then probably linguistic rules. So what are the kind of grammatic patterns in a particular language? And so that's pretty unique evidence within that domain. So if I want to make a claim about how Spanish verbs work, I might look at how they're used in conversation or to the extent that they follow certain grammatical rules. And the criteria for evaluation would be, for example, considering whether there are regional differences. So the generalizability of my claim about Spanish verbs. And that would be an example of domain-specific inductive reasoning because I'm thinking about the generalizability of something. Or I may evaluate something in terms of its accuracy, so its conformity to linguistic norms. And so as you can see from all of these examples, when we talk about critical thinking skills, so what it means to evaluate claims and evidence, and what it means to make sure that evidence supports claims, evaluate the quality of those claims, and consider the generalizability of claims. When we're talking about decomposing arguments, that happens in domain-specific ways. So every domain that we're talking about with students is going to have particular standards of evidence and particular standards of evaluation, particular criteria according to which we hold that evidence. And we'll talk about implications at the end of this lecture, but I'll just say one of the implications is part of what you're teaching when you're teaching a subject area is about what counts as evidence in your subject area, how that evidence is evaluated, how you form arguments in your subject area, and being very explicit about that. So if I'm in science class, I have to be very explicit as a teacher about saying, okay, what is your hypothesis as the claim? What is the evidence on which you're basing your hypothesis? How do I know that that's good evidence? Likewise, if I'm in history class, I want to say, what claim are you making? How do I know that that claim is an acceptable claim? How are you basing that evidence? How are you evaluating that evidence? And so with that, I'm going to pause here, and in our next segment of video, now that we've talked quite a bit about critical thinking skills, we're going to talk about the next two components of critical thinking instruction.